Hello. The job that I have had for the past few months has been eliminated. Um, so I'm back trying to find another job, and it's frustrating. But I was talking with a friend yesterday, and I was talking about a good voice that I have, and I think I could be a good interviewer. I think I could be a good radio personality. That's why I started up this YouTube channel, because I think that, well, I tried a few times, at least once, to get a job at a radio station. However, I don't think that I could stand a chance. Well, frankly, I was thinking it would be too competitive for me to have a reliable, think that I could have a good chance at it. So I didn't put a lot of effort into trying to get a job there, or I mean, in the radio industry itself. However, that's why I created this YouTube channel. However, I was talking with my friend and mentioning some good tips that I have learned about interviewing. So I thought that would be a good exercise in general, a good topic for a video. So I'd like to share them right now. These aren't in any particular order. Um, okay, I guess they're sort of in order of the importance that I felt. I guess they came to the more important ones came to mind earlier, and the majority of these tips have come from listening to Larry King and Art Bell. And I'll mention sometimes when when a particular tip was inspired by Art Bell or Larry King. All right, the first one was inspired by Larry King. He himself advised, don't ask yes or no questions. Ask questions that are based on um, what, where, when, how questions. Um, in other words, don't ask. And I know I tend to say just instinctively. I went through Toastmasters to train myself to avoid saying and I've gotten Toastmasters was interesting. It's an international organization that trains people and gives them opportunities to do public speaking, practice their public speaking. Going back to this, don't ask yes or no questions. Don't. The audience wants to learn more about the guest, so don't let the guest off easy by just asking a yes or no question, because the guest can simply say yes or no in the next question. Um, uh, can insert. I have number two. Can insert a question. Let me see. Can insert a question in editing so that if you want to break up an answer. Okay. Basically, if you find if as you're editing after the interview, if the guest has given an answer, first of all, that's very long and you want to break it up, find a moment within that answer to film like I am, film an extra question to be inserted in to break up the guest's answer into two parts. Literally, during editing, insert a new question in preparation for that answer that the guest has already answered. Um, so that also helps you in terms of editing down very long answers, because the interview should be more of an interaction. Um, okay, number three. This comes from Art Bell. I put, don't overload your knowledge in the guest's topic. This is another one of my favorites. Um, I found that, okay, Art Bell talked about metaphysical and paranormal topics. That was his shtick. And he would often have repeat guests. Um, for example, he may have Bud Hopkins, who likes to talk about, who liked, he's now deceased, but would talk about alien abduction. And he might have another author on some months down the road, um, David Jacobs or John Mack. And so I found that Art Bell would, when interviewing, for example, David Jacobs, might mention Bud Hopkins' name or John Mack's name and say, well, when I was interviewing John Mack, he talked about such and such. What do you think about this? And that was interesting, especially interesting because I think it let the audience feel, first of all, that those members of the audience that remembered the John Mack interview or Bud Hopkins, the earlier guest's interview, they may be asking that same, or they may have that same question in mind, and you build a bond or rapport. It's like Art Bell knows that you're thinking about this, and he's your voice during the conversation with the guest, the new guest. That's one thing. And number two, it builds a sense of community and camaraderie with the audience. As I felt as a guest, I mean, as an audience member listening to Art Bell's interviews, that there was some sense of consistency. He wasn't just interviewing each guest and then forgetting totally about that guest when it comes time to interview the next guest. He remembered these shows, and just like the listeners would remember these past shows, and it builds some sense of community, so that the audience feels some part of the show, that they are part of the show. Number three, oh no, okay. Number four, Art Bell would bring up ideas. Oh, I already have that. Okay, number four. Number five, establish rapport with the guest by finding a shared topic to talk about before the more probing questions. In other words, I'm saying begin with easier questions so that the guest can feel comfortable, and not only feel comfortable, but get into gear, into the mindset of answering questions, because he or she may have been driving around, being with kids, or in the park, or grocery shopping, or whatever. And so you'd want to ask some easier questions to give time for the guest to prepare and get into that frame of mind of an interview. Okay. 6, be prepared to ask unrehearsed questions of the guest if the guest mentions something interesting. Okay. During the course of the interview, I'm sure you would probably anticipate this anyway. It's easy logic. During the course of the interview, the guest may mention something interesting that you hadn't prepared to have a question for. So be ready. That requires you to be a good listener, but be ready to pause your list of questions in order to ask an impromptu question. If you hear something interesting that you're interested in, or chances are you're interested in, which would mean that the audience is probably also interested in. Okay. Number 7, begin with questions about origins. This is a more linear style of doing it. As you're sequencing the order of questions, begin asking those questions during the interview that establish who this person is that you're interviewing, and where the person started out, what are they doing, what makes them worthy, I was going to say famous, what makes them worthy of being interviewed. Um, Number 8, if it's a visual interview, conduct the interview in a place that jives with the topic. I would think this is pretty obvious, but if you're interviewing a farmer, go to either his own farm or into like a natural setting, some kind of natural setting. If it's a grocery store worker, try to get an interview, conduct the interview in a grocery store setting or someplace with food or something. Um, Visually, it just puts it into context. It gets the audience thinking. It just makes sense. It gets the audience thinking about that topic. Um, Number 9, and for an end question, your final question, always ask, is there something else that you haven't mentioned? Ask the guest, um, is there anything I haven't covered? Hopefully you will have thought of enough questions to let the guest talk a lot about his topic, but don't leave the interview. Don't end the interview without at least giving the guest some opportunity to mention something that may be on his or her mind that you haven't asked. Okay. 10. Use early questions to gauge the rhythm of the guest. Right. Guests are people, and people have certain quirks and certain rhythms and certain ways in which they speak, and certain speech patterns, um, certain ways that they relate to other people. So use those early questions to, while you're asking the questions, also gauge and be observant as to how the guest speaks and what questions seem to unnerve the guest. So you want to avoid those questions, the questions about those kinds of topics, um, and get a sense of how the person speaks. Um, and also, I suppose, be prepared to rephrase your question when you're looking at your question. Rephrase it to match or jibe with how the person's speaking. All right. Number 10. Oh, I already guessed. I already mentioned that. Number 11. Send a thank you email afterwards, and this works for, I guess, interviewing for a job. The questions about interviewing for a job. This video is about conducting an interview with somebody who's topic worthy. It's not necessarily a job interview. It's more like an interview about somebody who's famous or done something worthwhile. But in either case, I said email, but send some kind of message afterwards thanking the person for the person's time, and that gives you a good opportunity to, if you had forgotten to ask, are there any other things you'd like mentioned, it gives you a good opportunity to ask it then in that follow-up message. It also gives them your your contact information, so that the person can then contact you again and leave a message, leave a statement saying, perhaps perhaps we can do another interview, or leave the possibility, leave the idea there about having future interviews, because you don't want to burn bridges, you don't want to cut things off. All right. Number 12, ask a person beforehand to verify how to properly pronounce names. I remember when working in a newsroom, the anchor would go through the anchor. I remember the anchor not asking any particular guest, because obviously this was about something happening, I think in the Middle East or something, someplace. but she was asking a coworker, is this the proper pronunciation? And I remember in the script that the anchor would read, if I remember correctly, it would actually give, in parentheses, a pronunciation of that word. But you would want to find out, if not from the guest, at least do your diligent research in learning how to pronounce, first of all, the guest's name. You want to do that before the actual interview. You want to contact the guest, and as you're setting up your equipment, ask the guest, how do you pronounce your name? And hopefully you will have a list of terms that would come up with the topic that will likely be mentioned. Ask the person, how do you pronounce these words? So you don't look like an idiot it's for your own sake, so you don't embarrass yourself. And if you do mispronounce something, especially if not the guest's name, if you mispronounce a term, then I suspect that the audience will feel turned off from you as somebody at least competent enough to be worthy of interviewing this person. Okay. Number 13, find what the guest is currently working on. I found in I don't know about Art Bell's interviews, but certainly Larry King Live, Larry King and other famous interviewers would always have a question, what are you currently working on? Usually that's at the end of the interview or towards the end. That's usually like the last question before the comment about it's great, it was been a pleasure to have you as a guest and da 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 da. The question would be, what are you currently working on? Because depends on the guest. I would figure always consider asking that, but especially when the guest is on to hawk something or to brag about something or is heavily involved in the topic, whatever the topic is that you're talking, that the interview is about, chances are the guest is currently working on something or something similar to the topic that you've been discussing. So maybe that should be a question beforehand to ask, are you currently working on something? And then during the interview, towards the end of the interview, if the guest has previously indicated that there is a current project, you can then ask, are you currently working on anything? And let the guest mention it. I say that because as I'm doing this video right now, I'm thinking, well, what if you ask the guest a question and the guest says no? I guess that would look embarrassing. So I haven't ever seen times when a guest, I haven't been a fly on the wall of interviewers before they come on television and conduct the interview, ask the guest questions. But I'm guessing it's probably a good idea to ask the guest beforehand, what projects are you currently working on? And if they say no, then you know not to ask them during the interview and embarrass yourself. Well, frankly, embarrass the guest. Okay. And of course, obviously, if you don't have time to ask the question beforehand, or if it's an interview that you can edit later on before you publish it, obviously, if the person says, no, I'm not working on anything, you can easily edit that question and answer out. Number 14, ask for topics the guest prefers to avoid. This would be definitely a question you don't want to ask during the interview, but in preparation beforehand, ask if the guest has certain topics that they wish not to answer. And that's good, actually, if you want to keep the guest comfortable. There's some interviewers, of course, who it's their shtick to keep the guest a little uncomfortable. That's more like shock radio and so forth. But I, outside of that, you want to keep the guest comfortable. You don't want to embarrass the guest. Um, for example, if the guest has had some kind of scandal associated with the person, with him or her, ask beforehand. Should I ask any? Should I even delve into this topic? Um, if not, then that lets the guest feel more comfortable, I would think. And so when you go into the interview, you're letting the guest feel, you have a guest that feels comfortable talking with you. And that ties in with my earlier tidbit about getting the rhythm and asking easier questions of the guest. Okay, now there are some bonus things from the point of view, some bonus tips from the point of view of the guest, the interviewee. Um, number Number one, rephrase the question in your answer so that the interviewer can simply quote the so that you can simply quote the answer. Okay, let me rephrase that. I had noticed that many times, and in training, I don't remember exactly where I got it from. Maybe my college training background. When you're answering a question, don't just say yes or no. That ties in with that other tip. When you're answering a question, rephrase the question in your answer. In other words, I like UFOs just in general, so we'll go back to that. If the interviewer asks when were the earliest sightings of UFOs, or when did the UFO phenomenon begin, don't say as a guest, they began in 1947. Try to rephrase the question by saying, the UFO phenomenon began around 1947. So that way, that statement can be, if need be, can be edited out and used as a clip either somewhere else, or it won't be left dangling. It can be left in so that if need be, your question can be dropped. All right. So, and the other tip as an interviewee, as a guest, comes from Stanton Friedman. Well, actually, it was inspired by watching Stanton Friedman. He was a UFO expert, and he built himself quite a recognition as somebody who would always go on anytime there was some documentary or some news thing about UFOs, just about any time, he seemed to appear and be almost like the official spokesman. There's no official spokesman for anything related to UFOs, but it seemed like he always had to have some clip. He always had to appear in some clip talking about UFOs, and he had the same phrases he would use, to the point where I got bored just listening to those same phrases over and over and over. However, apparently it stuck. He would use the phrase "cosmic Watergate" consistently, and that goes back to when he began. That was around the time Watergate scandal occurred. So it was a quick catchphrase he could use. He also used "cosmic kindergarten," and it was like he had these rehearsed phrases or rehearsed comments about the phenomenon that he would insert in a lot of his on-air interviews. I don't know whether it was good or bad. It certainly made him recognizable. I still don't know whether really it's a good tip or a bad tip, because it turned me off after a while, because I would hear the same things, and I wanted to hear what else he thought about UFOs, but he tended to rely on those same tropes of answers or tropes of comments. Um, so that's the end of what I prepared in terms of tips for interviews, and maybe I've skipped something out. Are there, kind of like an interview, are there other tips or experiences that you've had either being a guest or being an interviewer? Mention them in the comments, and I will definitely look through the comments and add them in. Perhaps if there are enough of them, do a follow-up video to this. Okay, that's it for now. And I'm thinking of, for a next topic, I'm thinking of making a list or a sort of an expository summary, my plan if I were to create a cult, because I think cults are one of the most destructive cults, negative cults, are one of the most destructive things in our society, aside from lack of resources and the national debt, which relates directly to lack of resources. And the there's a term, basically the belief that you know more than you really do. Um, those are some of the most destructive things in our society, I believe. But I've done a lot of study on cults. Of course, that springs from my interest in UFOs. There's a contactee movement. Cults, as you can imagine, spring up in amidst interest in UFOs and the paranormal. So I thought for a long while I'm too honest and sincere and genuine to become a cult leader. However, recently I was listening to a few documentaries about cult leaders and how they sprang up, and they really do. If you can be able to be effective, you can make a lot of money and get a lot of followers, get a lot of audience, public attention. But I'm too conscientious for that. However, I would like to share tricks and methods that I've learned about. So I thought it would be fun in general. So this would be a video about how I would create and maintain a cult. A little bit for my own ego, but maintain a cult so that you can be wary and avoid getting sucked into one yourself. Okay, until next time. Bye.